Hi folks, you should be turned to your notes page. We are going to discuss the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War because they're intertwined. It's important to understand them both together. So your objectives are for you to identify how the introduction of nuclear weapons impacted the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and for you to explain how the use of the atomic bomb helped end World War II. So towards the end of the war, the big three, which are Churchill from Great Britain, Roosevelt from the US, and Stalin from the Soviet Union, met at the Yalta Conference. They met intending to plan how things were going to go after they had defeated the Axis powers in Europe. They discussed three things specifically that are important for you to know. The first thing they discussed was what would happen with Poland. So, the Soviet Union actually came from this way and helped liberate the Polish from the Nazis. So they came and kind of pushed the Nazis back into Germany out of Poland. And Stalin made the point that any time that the Soviet Union had ever been invaded, it had been through Poland. So they wanted to establish some sort of communist government in Poland that would be sympathetic to their needs and their views. However, the previous government in Poland was not communist. So Roosevelt and Churchill were kind of like, you should probably let them choose what type of government they want instead of us. So what they did was they compromised, and they said that Stalin could have a little bit of influence in Poland, but not too much. They also made the Declaration on Liberated Europe. And really, all you need to know about this is they decided together that everyone should be able to choose whatever type of government that they wanted. So pretty similar to the conversation they were having about Poland. These newly freed countries, or these new countries that were being created after the war in Eastern Europe, should be able to have democratic representative governments that they choose to implement instead of it being forced on them. And they also decided that Germany, this is Germany, would be divided into 4 zones. Each of the Allied powers, the big Allied powers, would get its own zone. So you can see Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and France. In addition to that, Berlin, which is right here, it's that little tiny place right there, Berlin was also split into 4 zones. And you can see the graph here, Great Britain, France, the United States, and then Russia. So these things were decided at the Yalta Conference, and everyone seemed like they were on the same page. However, 2 weeks later, Poland and Romania are actually forced to become communist nations by the Soviet Union. So the United States and Great Britain are a bit annoyed with Stalin because that's not the commitment he made at Yalta. So this begins our conversation about how the Soviets and the Americans had completely different ideas on a lot of things. And you can see here that political system, economic system, religion, and individual rights are all completely different for both of them. You might take a second to jot down some of these. What's important to know here, though, is that this main division here is the communism versus capitalism. Remember, communism is when the government has a lot of control over the economy, there's not any private property, and the goal is to provide equality for everyone. Whereas the United States is a capitalist country. We believe in private property, and that supply and demand should really decide how much things cost or how much should be created instead of the government. There's little government involvement in business in a capitalist democracy. Some more foreign policies and ideas that the Soviets and the Americans do not agree on. These are important to know. At the end of the war, the Soviets thought that they should keep Germany weak so that they'd be less of a threat. However, the Americans thought, we need to rebuild Germany so they don't start a war like this again. Same thing with Eastern Europe. The Soviets wanted Eastern Europe to be a buffer zone. And this is a zone of protection, so that way they could not be invaded from the West. However, the United States thought, well, we want to give them some economic aid and help them rebuild their countries from this crazy war, and they wanted to promote capitalism and democracy. We're going to continue talking about the nuclear arms race and the space race, but here's kind of some, really brief ideas behind the differences. The US developed the first atomic bomb, however, the Soviet Union developed one shortly after. They both really stockpiled those weapons to threaten each other. And then you have the space race, in which they're both attempting to reach the moon and put out satellites, and you can see the US is only a year behind the Soviet Union there. So a big event takes place in April of 1945. Remember, the war is still going on. And Roosevelt dies. He has a stroke and he dies. And this means that his vice president, Harry Truman, becomes the president. The day Truman took office, he is quoted as saying, "We must stand up to the Russians." This is important because some people blame the entire Cold War on Truman. So when Roosevelt dies, Truman becomes president, and the war ends in Europe less than a month later. So the war ends in Europe in May, and then there's Potsdam. So this conference is in July to August. It's very early August is when it ends. And the big powers get together again. And Truman really calls out Stalin because he's not keeping his word. He does mention the atomic bomb to Stalin, and this makes him very annoyed. Stalin feels like he's being bullied, like the United States is kind of waving this huge weapon in their face and kind of bullying them. And they also fought about what to do with Germany and Eastern Europe. So Truman goes in there, he calls out Stalin for not keeping his word from Yalta, and the relationship, even though they look like they're smiling and having a good time here, is not a good one at all. So let's talk about how the war actually ends. I've got this timeline here for you, and I just want to point out something really important. The Japanese began asking for peace in May, back when Europe was defeated. So this is important, but the Allied powers wouldn't accept their peace offerings because they weren't unconditionally surrendering. They weren't surrendering with no requirements, and that's what the Allied powers wanted. So the United States drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th. And 2 days after that, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. This right here is very important. You can see the competition happening day by day between the US and the Soviet Union. They both wanted to end this war. So the United States reacts to the Soviet Union invading Japanese territory by dropping the second atomic bomb. So the Fat Man is dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th, the day after the Soviets invade Japan. So this right here, this triangle right here, is really important because this is a conflict not only between the Allied powers and Japan, but also between the United States and the Soviet Union. So some people say that Harry Truman caused the Cold War. It is all his fault. And you can decide to believe that or not. But a few things to consider. Number one, we already talked about on the timeline about how the Japanese were willing to surrender. They just had a few terms and conditions. So they were pretty much done fighting. Some people argue that Truman wanted to drop that bomb and end that war before Stalin did, so that way the United States would seem like the hero and the winner, and they could really spread their ideas and their influence throughout the region, as opposed to the Soviet Union. And then lastly, Some people also say that Truman was trying to intimidate or bully the Soviet Union because they hadn't kept their promises that they made at Yalta. They were expanding into Eastern Europe, and they were forcing Poland and Romania to become communist. So some people think that Truman decided to drop these bombs to really intimidate the Soviet Union instead of actually defeat Japan. So this is a great quote here. After the bomb was dropped, Stalin was furious. The place Russia had earned as a world power by its victory in the war had been snatched away. Hiroshima has shaken the whole world, he is said to have told his foreign policy advisor. The balance has been destroyed. So this is when the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union really comes to a huge competition. So then the Iron Curtain goes up, and I'm sure you've heard this term before from world history. This is the symbolic separation of Soviet-influenced communist countries in Europe and the capitalist democratic influenced countries in Europe. So Europe is aligned, the West is the Soviet Union, whereas the East is aligned with the United States. And these small countries right here are called satellite nations. They're seen as not directly under control of the Soviet Union, but they pretty much are. So you can see here all of the influence that the Soviet Union eventually gained. So as of right now, what you should do is stop the video and answer your understanding check questions. Make sure you turn your card to red when you are finished.